Beatriz Colomina is Professor of Architecture as well as founding director of the program in Media and Modernity at Princeton University. She's an architectural historian and theorist who takes an interdisciplinary and I would say also an externalist approach to architecture. She has, of course, written and published extensively. Beatriz has also curated a number of innovative exhibitions, which she developed together with teams of PhD students. Maybe that's the reason why I see so many young faces here. One example or two examples: Clip Stamp Fold, the Radical Architecture of Little Magazines, 2006, or Playboy Architecture, 1953 to 79. Her most recent collaborative project with PhD students, Radical Pedagogies, Action, Reaction, Interaction, was exhibited at the 2014 Venice Biennale of Architecture, where it won a special award. Beatriz, we are delighted to have you here at the Academy. I look forward to your talk and the discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much, Wolf, for your very generous introduction. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness in all your introductions, and thank you very much for this one. And thank you, all of you, for coming all the way here to Wannsee. It's really nice to see you. I wasn't sure what to make or what to expect of this place myself. I had some friends, snotty friends in New York, that told me that Wannsee was really too far away from the action and not really Berlin. And being the typical New York paranoid that I am, I kind of anticipated immediately running out of here every day at the first opportunity. But then something else happened. Every time I went into Berlin, something somehow pulled me back deeper into Wannsee. For example, this is one of my first days in the academy, and I decided to go to the city precisely to a lecture. And there, in the reception, in the balcony over the Parisi Platz, I met Manfred Nix, Professor Manfred Nix, who is here tonight. And somehow we start talking about what are, what I'm doing, and I say I'm in the academy, and he turned out to be a neighbor in Amsterdam. So not just someone from Wannsee, that would have been difficult already, a neighbor. I mean, what are the chances, right? And we start talking about the topic of my research, and somehow I happened to mention something about tuberculosis, and then Manfred said that actually there are sanatoria on the other side of the lake, that people came to Wannsee for the cure, for the tuberculosis cure, that the air in Wannsee was cleaner than in other parts of Berlin, and that people came for that reason. So I started to see this area then as kind of the magic mountain of Berlin, and decided, or perhaps it was decided for me, to change the topic of my research and retake a question that has been with me for a very long time, like a kind of virus, a kind of dormant virus that surfaces every now and then, but never completely takes over. It goes back, actually, this virus goes back at least 30 years to my very first year in New York, when I started to see architecture in terms of medicine, architecture in terms of pathologies, real and imagined. I couldn't possibly resist this question here, so I changed my topic. I was intended to do something else, as Wolf say, and decided to go back to the question of tuberculosis. And I immediately imagined myself also somehow as a patient in a sanatorium here, taking the cure, which is probably what made me feel so comfortable in this place. All of a sudden, everything made sense. The isolation, the lake, the forest, the fantastic food of Reinhold, the extraordinary light, the great care of all the fantastic professionals here in the academy, the beautiful pavilion in the garden that Frank and Regina has given us as a kind of sun pavilion for the cure. So everything all of a sudden made sense. So to all of you, thank you very much for your kindness and for your entertainment you provide. It's really been a lot of fun to be here. So what is this topic of X-ray architecture? Oh, what happened here? You cannot sleep, huh? All right, so what is this modern architecture? What is the theme in a nutshell? Modern architecture, which as you probably know, was launched in the 1920s by an international group of avant-garde architects, many, by the way, German, and with Berlin as a key acupuncture point, has been usually understood in terms of functional efficiency, new materials, glass, reinforced concrete, steel, etc., new technologies of construction, and the machine aesthetics. In contrast, the hypothesis of these projects is, as Wolf already said, that the architecture of the early 20th century was shaped by the dominant kind of medical obsession of its time with precisely tuberculosis. It is, in that sense, as if the astonishing, because it's really astonishing, success of modern architecture depended on the association with health. Is internationalism the consequence of the global spread of a disease it was meant to resist? Modernity itself is driven by illness. The engine of modern architecture is not a heroic, shiny, functional machine marching across the globe, but a languid, fragile body suspended outside daily life. The difficulty of each breath, and therefore the treasure of each breath, the melancholy of modernity then. One could write an entire book about this question, about the impact of tuberculosis on modern architecture. Perhaps I'm writing this book, beginning perhaps with the collaborations between architects and doctors in tuberculosis sanatorios, such as this one, Paimio, in Finland, Alvar Aalto. This is already 1929. And it's dramatic, as you can see, terraces in the sky here, and it's bedrooms of clean lines, no ornaments, and minimum surfaces for the accumulation of dust. You know, of course, that dust was what they were all afraid of. It contained the bacillus. The room has all the qualities of a modern interior. We could live there. I could live there. But in fact, it's also a very high-performance room, with the sanitary fittings designed also by Alvar and Aino Aalto, included the angles of the basin on the sinks designed so that not to splash, and even the spiton, which is designed to minimize sound. But the main technology was the top floor terrace, 7 stories up in the above the forest, where patients were wheeled out to take the fresh air and the sun. Here we are, you can feel the cold in Finland, right? In any case, the terrace at a certain point had to be closed off because the nurses couldn't keep up with the number of patients, of desperate patients, that would throw themselves off every time a nurse turned around. Modern architecture as a kind of form of assisted suicide, you could argue. Even today, even today, they don't let you up in the terrace for fear that they will jump out. We went to visit this building with Mark, and I am arguing like a typical Spanish idiot. No, but you know, I live in New York. I mean, if I had that idea, I had better options. No, mine. So they don't let you in for fear that you will. Of course, later research demonstrated that there was not a lot of scientific basis for that kind of art of air and sun therapy. Sometimes it even precipitated the end at Paimio, quite literally. The history of modern architecture is full of sanatoria. You can think about Hofmann's famous Purkersdorf. This is the beginning of the century. 903 outside Vienna, who was frequented by a notable circle of patients, including Gustav Mahler, Arnold Schönberg, Solomon Moser, and Hugo von Hofmannsthal. Even Hofmann, sometimes the architect, sometimes John, because this is the point, that this sanatoria from the turn of the century had become a new kind of social space for the bourgeoisie. Tuberculosis actually accepted patients not just with tuberculosis, but with a wide range of medical conditions, including nervous disorders, neurasthenia, eating disorders, substance abuse, and hysteria. It was built, the Sanatoria, in the site of an earlier one founded by the psychiatrist Richard Kraft-Ebing, who had argued that modern metropolis was damaging the nerves of the inhabitants and believed in the light, in nature, and simplicity as a form of therapy. In 1885, he wrote this book on the healthy and sick nerves and psychopathia sexualis. Here you have him sitting there in a love seat with his wife. He also coined, by the way, the terms sadismo and masochismo. Health, in other words, was understood in psychosexual and architectural terms. Critics hail the building as one of clarity and truth. The success, in fact, of the Sanatoria itself owe enormously to the modernity of the architecture, which at that time modern was already becoming a new and sophisticated taste for the bourgeoisie. But Kraft-Ebing, and also they have this thing about everybody has to eat in this long table. They have to eat together in the Sanatoria. But Kraft-Ebing may have also have some influence in architectural theories, because you find at the same time urban planners such as Camillo Sitte, who argue that the modern city was causing the design of the modern city, the Ringstrasse and the abstraction of plans like Wagner was causing agoraphobia. He actually describes in great detail agoraphobia to the point that you realize that he himself must have been suffering from agoraphobia, because otherwise, I mean, what will he describes this person sweating in the street about to cross this big square, and you go like, okay, but I mean, where did you get this idea from? So I mean, which is interesting, because actually agoraphobia is supposed to be illness of women. Anyway, Adolf Loos, also a student, by the way, of masochismo, argues that modern man is the man with the modern nerve. Here is his lecture in Paris. Can tolerate ornament in the same way that he can not eat anymore a stuffed bird or covered with plumage. He eats roast beef. Just when I thought, I mean, I was about to disappear into all this Viennese stuff because it's so fascinating to me, but just when I thought that this was a very Viennese thing with the nerves, I read again Paul Servat, Glass Architecture of 1914, where I read that Sanatoria also will want glass buildings. The influence of a splendid glass architecture on the nerves is indisputable. Indisputable. Right? So maybe we'll go back to this later. Davos, of course, you always have heard of Davos, was the epicenter of a phenomenon of the modern cure. In 1910, there were already 26 sanatoria plus 46 hotels that were taking consumptives. The model was this one, the first one, the South, built around 1900. It was the result of a collaboration, again, between a doctor and two very young architects from Zurich, Feldhard and Hafeli. The building was actually the first concrete and steel structure in Switzerland. So the most advanced medical treatment coincides precisely with the most advanced technology in architecture. The architecture, as you can see, is almost brutally modern in its horizontality and its abstraction. The whole building is like an ocean liner. Everything is subordinated to these terraces as therapeutic spaces, dimension for a patient lying down in a specially designed bed, and in all seasons. Here they have in somehow relatively good weather, and here you have them in the winter. And you wonder, how long do you have to be there to have that kind of accumulation of snow in you? And in fact, for what I have read, some sanatoriums, many of those sanatoriums were from 9 to 9, so you will be taking the cure of the air from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. or from 10 p.m. to, you know, really unbelievable, right? And they seem actually quite happy if you know. I mean, here I've been pissed off. I mean, particularly these two women over there. That one with the cap, I think, is still there. Look at him, he's wonderful. But they seem also happy there, like a group, because again, it's also part of this social thing. But also, as I say, the sanatorium was becoming a new kind of a social space for the upper class and the intelligentsia. This is the Ball Sanatorium, also in Davos, where Katia Mann stayed in 9/11, and which inspired Thomas Mann to write The Magic Mountain and the social life in this very modern building, everything white, even the architecture of the here is the dining room all white, and even the architecture of this patient receiving here the hydrotherapy all in this white space. Katia, who was actually born Katharina Prinsheim, was one of the first patients in this brand new sanatorium. She had fell ill in 9/11. A year after the birth of her fourth child. Her mother was convinced that Katia was not suffering from tuberculosis but for exhaustion, having had 4 children and 2 miscarriages in less than 5 years. She married at the age of 21. This is a photograph of her in 1905, the year she married. So in 5 years, she had 4 children and 2, this is a photograph a little bit later, well, quite a bit later. So she also had to manage, according to her mother, a large household and even was typing Mann's manuscript. She, who had been asked by her mother to abandon her studies of physics and mathematics to marry Thomas Mann at the age of 21. Anybody will have a nervous breakdown. I'll have a nervous breakdown. Whatever her ailment, he was in and out of sanatoriums between 9/11 and 1914. And she went back and had 2 more kids, as you can see in the picture. But she had a positive experience. She said she liked being in the sanatorium. It made her very strong to stand it all these things to come. Of course, it's 1914 when she finally gets out of sanatorium. So a lot of very terrible things are about to happen, and she felt that the sanatorium had made her stronger to stand it all. This modern ocean liner environment for the rich and fabulous becomes democratized with the sanatorium such as Zonestral. This is now in 1925 in Hilversum, 1 hour outside of Amsterdam. Zonestral actually means sunbeam in Dutch. It was designed by Jan Ducker and Bernard Bizuet as a sanatorium for the Dutch Diamond Workers Union. In this reinforced concrete white building, the medical properties of the architecture are, as you can see, taken to the stream. It's almost as a kind of manifesto. The building is a health machine, a factory for the manufacturing of healthy bodies. Here is the slogan, light, air, sun. The patients, as you can see, are now wheeled out of their independent room. This is less about the social space that we have seen so far. There is less interaction among patients who seem to have all of them to have their heads inside the room. The interaction is with the sun and with the machines. They also seem to have individual rooms, and I went looking for pictures and I found this. And you will think it's better to have an individual room, right? But then I was reading Robert Bernhardt, of course, who was also for many years suffering from tuberculosis in and out of sanatorium, and the idea of tuberculosis, of course, infiltrates all his writings. Think about Wittgenstein's nephew and so many other books. But then reading him again, I realized, or I became aware, that the terrifying thing in a sanatorium was precisely when you were moved into an individual room. That could only mean one thing. But I could continue with this kind of fascinating, at least for me, history of the sanatoriums, but I'm interested in something else. More significant for me than the architecture of the sanatorium is precisely the impact of the medical thought on modern architecture, the constant preoccupation with ventilation, sunlight, hygiene, white walls. As Ulrich, the figure of the character in Robert Mann, the man without qualities, says, modern man is born in a hospital and dies in a hospital. Hence, he should also live in a place like a hospital. This maxim, he adds, has just been formulated by a leading architect, and another one demanded movable partition walls in flats. I love this idea of the movable partitions as kind of like in the hospitals, no? That's exactly what's happening in architecture. In fact, every building becomes a sanatorium. Take, for example, the open-air school of 1929, a couple of years after Thonestral, the same architects, Ducker and BUA, applied the same principles now to healthy children. The very open-air school actually was also around here in Berlin. It's the Balde School in Charlottenburg, which opened in 1904 and applied the theories of light, sun, and fresh air to what they understood at the time as weak children, pre-tubercular. The French called them pre-tubercular children of families with tuberculosis, or children with anemia, or children that were weak, and they were sent to this open-air school. It started a movement that spread around the world, with the architecture going from the lightweight structures that you saw in the forest without walls to metal, in this case brick is England, and metal and concrete buildings in France without walls, with the bones of the structure fully exposed, as in this open school in Suresnes, creating an uncanny resemblance between the body of the building and the body of the breathing occupant. But the radicality of the open-air school is precisely that it was for healthy children. Modern architecture, in other words, goes from being the cure for TB to being a device for the prevention of TB. Modern architecture is like a light device, like all these other light devices at the time that were popular for the treatment of illness. This is light therapy around 1937. I guess that's what you have to do when it's winter, right? So all that generation, the least sign of a cold, light therapy, which is, of course, then produces a lot of cancer of the skin problems. It will seem that it was not just architects, but also critics and historians that were advocating life in a sanatorium. Take, for example, this little book of Gideon that I was so happy to find one day, the first year I arrived in New York, in a bookstore, 1929, little book, not so well known, Befriete Wohnen, Liberated the Dwelling, subtitle, Light Luft öffnen, light air opening, almost like a slogan of a sanatorium. Well, between the covers of a book that advertises itself as being on the modern house, we find that half of the illustrations are dedicated to hospitals and like this hospital of Richard Docker in Beiblingen, or again the Thonestral of Vijue and Davos, and here is Thonestral again, and Davos, of course, sports stadia, and these people in Davos taking the cure, and sports stadia, images of gymnastics, of sunbathing, of tennis, anything. By the time we finally get to the houses, we may have already forgotten that we had bought ourselves a little book on the modern house, because we haven't seen any yet. And then this is the crazy thing. By the time you get to the houses seem to have been turned into sanatoriums themselves, with convalescents resting on long chairs on the terrace, as in this picture of Maschafeli house in Zurich of 1928, or into gyms, as is the Marcel Breuer bedroom for Piscator in Berlin of 1927, with all the exercise equipment, or with Richard Docker's terrace with exercise equipment in the working Bourbon-Siedlung house in the Weissenhof in Stuttgart of 1927. And it's not just Gideon, that, by the way, also had reasons to be interested in tuberculosis, or known about tuberculosis. His wife, Carola, the famous historian Carola Gideon Becker, also suffered from tuberculosis, and also was, tuberculosis was so prevalent that you scratch a little bit and everybody was touched, or their wife was touched, or somebody had it. But another influential book, Richard Docker, Terrasse and Tip of 1927, follows the development of the terrace in modern architecture, again from the sanatorium in Beiblingen. This is his own sanatorium, these are the rooms, proceeding to Thonestral again, to Davos, and so on. And before we know, we are making this seamless transition from the terraces of the Krankenhaus to the terraces of, and here the kiddies also taking the cure in the terrace. And before we know, we are making this seamless transition from the terraces of the sanatorio to the terraces of the modern house, with diagrams showing the penetration of the rays in modern sanatorium and in modern houses. And the book concludes with a series of photographs, again, many of them are the same than in Gideon, of domestic terraces furnished with exercise equipment, as this one of Docker's apartment in the Weissenhof, or the Villa years, or Villa Noel at years of Mariette Stevens, again with the terraces, and the open air room designed by Pierre Charot, and the swimming pool with all this exercise equipment, and those are actually stills from Man Ray that shoot a beautiful film in this house. Not only did modern architects emphasize health and exercise, and sometimes they even put themselves, like they give example, like this is Ducker jumping into the water, not exactly your typical heroic image of the modern architect. There he is. So not only did modern architects emphasize health and exercise in opposition to the dangers of the disease, but in many cases their architecture was understood that way. The building became unconsciously identified with the healthy body. For example, Mies van der Rohe Tugendhat house in Brno in 1929, who was then abandoned during the German occupation of Czechoslovakia, was thrown into a gymnasium for young children by the communist bureaucrats who presumably were unaware that the house had been photographed in precisely this spirit in its early years. So you have early 1930s photographs of naked Tugendhat children playing in the sun on the terrace that are uncannily echo in the 1960s images of children exercising in the so they take this house, and the first thing they say, oh, we should turn it into a hospital, into a rehabilitation center for handicapped children. Modern architecture, in other words, was unproblematically understood as a kind of medical equipment, a mechanism for protecting and enhancing the body. Even entire cities, like in Cité Industrielle of Tony Garnier, the proposal for a utopian industrial city in 1904, features the heliotherapy building of the hospital in the highest point of the plan, and the sports center right in the middle of the town, as if replacing the cathedral of medieval times. Health has become a new form of religion. Gideon described this project in his 1928 book, Building in France, Building in Iron, Building in Ferroconcrete, and he says, elevators carry the convalescent in his bed to the generous terraces to which the roof had been converted. The eye, through the interplay of the various horizontal surfaces, has an impression of the air always separating and hovering. Now, Gideon's emphasis on the horizontality of both the convalescent and of modern architecture suggests perhaps a completely different explanation of the horizontal framing of modern architecture than those who I myself have supported by linking the horizontal window with cinema. Could the relentless horizontal framing of modern architecture be related to the horizontality of the occupant, the TB convalescent, lying on the chest, the paradigmatic client of modern architecture? This is again Paimio with the terrace and the chairs, and this is Aino Aalto who designed the chair, and the hospital with Alvar Aalto, and here is the chair. And it's also interesting to me that an architect will decide to portray herself as a sick person lying on the terrace of Paimio on the chairs. Not exactly your heroic image. And of course, we cannot forget the horizontality of the psychoanalytical patient. In many ways, the 20th century is the century of the bed. The architecture of the early 20th century cannot be understood outside tuberculosis. Indeed, the principles of modern architecture seem to have been taken straight out of a medical test on the disease. A year before, the German microbiologist Robert Koch discovered the tubercle bacillus in 1882. A standard medical book on the disease gave as causes of the disease unfavorable climate, sedentary indoor life, defective ventilation, and deficiency of light. This is what believed that caused the disease. It took a long time for these notions to lose credibility. As Susan Sontag put it, the TB patient was thought to be helped, even cured, by a change in environment. There was a notion that TB was a wet disease, a disease of humid and dank cities, that the inside of the body had become damp and had to be dried out. Modern architecture, and this is of course the paper of Robert Koch, In 1882, The Etiology of Tuberculosis. Modern architecture offered health precisely by providing such a change in environment. 19th century architecture was immediately demonized as unhealthy, and sun, light, ventilation, exercise, roof gardens, hygiene and quietness were offered as a means to prevent, if not to cure, tuberculosis. The publicity campaign of modern architecture was organized around contemporary beliefs about tuberculosis and fears of the disease. For example, in his book, The Radiant City of 1935, Le Corbusier dismisses what he calls the natural ground as, he says, dispenser of rheumatism and tuberculosis, and declares it the enemy of man. These are his words. He insists on detaching the house with the help of pilotis. Pilotis are these thin columns. From the wet, he says, humid ground where disease breeds, and on using the roof as garden for sunbathing and exercises. Again, nobody seemed to know anything about the skin cancer at that time, but that will be a different story. To reinforce his point, he actually takes images from medical texts as architectural illustrations, showing the lungs and even their inner workings, and gives architectural illustration on medical labels, as when a photograph of an old part of Paris becomes historic Paris, tubercular Paris. Le Corbusier develops in his book a concept of exact respiration, whereby the indoor air is continuously circulated, he says, and clean, made dust-free, disinfected, and ready to be consumed by the lungs. This is what he's talking about air conditioning, but this is how he described it. Dust-free, disinfected, and ready to be consumed by the lungs. One by one, all the characteristic features of modern architecture, pilotis, roof garden, glass walls, and clean air turn out to be presented as medical devices. Even the walls are white to reveal any contamination. Modern buildings start to look like X-rays. The impact of technology of X-ray is evident in the work of many avant-garde architects of the early decades of the 20th century. Mies van der Rohe not only writes about his work as a skin and bones architecture, but also renders his projects as this skyscraper in the Friedrichstrasse and his glass skyscraper of 1922 as if you were seeing them through an X-ray machine. Mies, by the way, was deeply interested in X-rays images. He used them as illustration in his articles, like in this X-ray that he uses in an article in the magazine Gestaltung, and even put a bone alongside his skyscraper in this issue of Mirth. But of course, he was not alone. Books of modern architecture are filled with images of glowing glass screens revealing inner bones and organs. Think, for example, about Le Corbusier project for a glass skyscraper, Walter Gropius, this is still Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius' Bauhaus of 1925, Brinkmann and Van der Broek's Barnelle factory in Rotterdam of 1925, Eric Mendelssohn's Socken department store in Stuttgart, George Keck Crystal House in the 1933 World Fair in Chicago, the Glass Palace in the Netherlands, in Herlin in 1935, and countless other examples. Here is also Bucky Fuller, for example. Books of modern architecture, if you start thinking about it this way, start to look like collections of X-rays. This is more than a dominant aesthetics. It's a symptom of a deep-seated philosophy of design derived from medical discourse. In fact, the development of the X-ray and of modern architecture coincide, and they evolve in parallel. So if experiments with glass were numerous in the early years of the century, they tend to be like isolated, exoteric projects by avant-garde architects, in the same that also these were experimental projects. Here is the first X-ray, and that one is also 1896, a hand with a back suit, and here there are these guys trying to figure out how you take an X-ray of a hand. Well, in architecture, also the beginnings are experimental, like with Bruno Tau's glass pavilion. They are usually actually temporal pavilions in fair, like the Mies Barcelona pavilion. Here is Mies with the then King of Spain during the inauguration. or the glass house in Chicago in the World Fair, etc., or the unrealized project of Mies of a glass house in the hillside. It was only precisely at mid-century, and just as the X-ray becomes also a mass phenomenon, that the glass house is realized in projects like the Farnsworth house of Mies near Chicago, and the Philip Johnson glass house in Connecticut. And, of course, these are esoteric, if you want, examples, but it becomes democratized, if you want. It becomes a mass phenomenon when everybody seems to have a picture window in America, like you can see in this advertisement. To be truly modern, you have to have a twindo, right, with these little twins there with their dolls. And it's not just the house. It would seem that everything in the house has to be seen through, from the Pyre's cookware to the you have to see into everything. The BRAP, the ovens and the washing machines, everything you have to see. And everything, by the way, is also subjected to X-ray, even cars, even this big Jeep, and even the Volkswagen is advertised as a medic car, not to mention all these shoe-fitting devices with X-rays that were actually common in all the shoe stores in that generation right after the war. And you think, I mean, did their feet fell off? At that point, imagine all these kids going out of school and putting just to put the feet in the machine. Screening the body for TB meant, of course, penetrating with the gaze areas of the body that were previously invisible. The technology had been available in sanatoria since the beginning of the century. By the 20s, it was a routine part of the examination of those with visible symptoms. It's kind of funny because if you look at all these images and you didn't read anything, you will think that this is a disease of women, right? Because they are all like women, but it's not. It's actually a lot more prevalent in men than in women, but all the images in all the books are women. So in any case, by the 20s, it was part of the routine of examination if you were showing already some symptoms. But apparently, diagnosis of tuberculosis continued to be very difficult, with doctors confusing it with a variety of other illnesses, including bronchitis, chronic indigestion, malaria, neurasthenia, and typhoid fever. In other words, they had no idea what they were talking about, and they wanted to see inside the body to evaluate the damage already done. Only in the 1930s did the max X-raying of the entire of huge amounts of citizens on a regular basis start, which gives way to this kind of phenomena in which not only you give your photograph of your rosy person to your boyfriend to tongue with all my love, but you also give the X-ray, so you are clean and nice inside and outside. No, the other way around, I've never seen it. I've never seen a boy giving it to his girlfriend. With the post-war mobilization against television, tuberculosis, there is all these programs for the max X-raying of the population using mobile machines in places such as department store, industries, etc., suburban streets, public markets. So over a period of half a century, what has been an experimental medical tool was transformed into a mechanism of surveillance for the entire population. Immediately, there is this incredible association, which I found really striking, between the X-ray and precisely the glass house. This is already in popular culture. For example, there is this film called Highlights and Shadow. These are two stills from this film of 1937, a film trying to demonstrate the virtues of X-ray in disease prevention. Of course, it was very difficult to convince people to have their X-ray, and it's not that they were afraid of radiation. They didn't know anything about radiation. They were afraid of the exposure. This is what is interesting, of the loss of privacy. So they are trying to convince people, and there is this filmmaker in Kodak laboratories that does this film, in which you see a woman wearing this swimming suit strapped to the laboratory table, and where her body is subjected to X-rays. the photograph gives way to the X-ray, and then the narrator, of course a male narrator, declares, "This young lady, to whom henceforth a glass house should hold no terrors, will, after an examination of a radiograph, be reassured that she indeed is physically fit." So you will have noticed, perhaps, that he's not saying that this young lady, after having examined her X-ray, will be reassured that she's healthy. She's saying in the middle, out of nowhere, that after she will no longer be afraid of living in a glass house. Right? Henceforth, not even afraid, terror. She will have no terror. Henceforth, a glass house will hold no terror. So obviously, this question of the indisputable for the nerves is really very disputable. The glass house, in any case, is acting here as a symbol of both a new form of surveillance and of health. A similar set of association, in case you think that this is a kind of crazy thing of popular culture, can be found in the discourse of canonic works of architecture. In an interview in House Beautiful, for example, Edith Farnsworth, a successful doctor in Chicago, by the way, compared her famous weekend house designed by Miss van der Rohe to an X-ray, and she says, "I don't keep a garbage under my sink, a garbage can under my sink. Do you know why? Because you can see the whole kitchen from the road on the way in here, and the can will spoil the appearance of the house. So I hide it in the closet further down from the sink." Miss talks about free space, but this space is very fixed. I can even put a clothes hanger in my house without considering how it affects everything from the outside. Any arrangement of furniture becomes a major problem because the house is transparent like an X-ray. Right? So the use of the metaphor of the X-ray is, of course, not accidental. It's not by chance that in the course of the same interview, he goes on to say that there is a local rumor that the house is a tuberculosis sanatorium. So she describes herself, the house, as an X-ray, and in the villas, they say that the house is a sanatorium. Once again, modern architecture was literally understood as a piece of medical equipment, and once again, a doctor-architect, if you want, relationship. Farnsworth, the doctor, and Miss, the architect, and she's so concerned with the kitchen being seen from the road. But you know, I don't know whether you noticed, this is her bedroom over there, here. So I don't know what's about the garbage can. How about your bed, right? I don't get it. But anyway, it's interesting. Of course, we could go back also historically, because this relationship that I just mentioned between architecture and medicine is actually a very old story. Architecture has always followed medicine. You can go back to the Greeks and the theories of the four humors, for example. Architectural discourse has, of course, from the beginning also associated body and building. You are, of course, very familiar with this image of the Vitruvian man of Leonardo da Vinci, depicting the correlation of the ideal human proportions with the ideal proportions of a building, according to the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius. But the hypothesis of this research project is that the body that architectural discourse describes is actually the medical body, a body that is reconstructed by each new theory of health. And to stay with Leonardo, where this man is very famous, less famous, but you can see in his work, is that there are always these cutaway views of architectural interiors that even appear in the same page as anatomical drawings. By the way, he also understands the interior of the brain and of the womb in architectural terms as enclosures whose envelopes has to be cut through to reveal their secrets. The central reference, therefore, for architecture is no longer, even in Leonardo, a whole body, but a dissected, fragmented, and analyzed body. As medical representations change, so did architectural representation. For example, you have here Viollet-le-Duc, who in his Dictionnaire raisonné of 1854 presents illustrated with perspectival sectional cutaway drawings showing medieval buildings as if they were dissected. He had been influenced by Cuvier, by his lessons of, I don't know how you say, anatomie comparée, right? Calling for a study, he says, of medieval architecture as the study of an animate being involving dissection. That's what Viollet-le-Duc says, to allow separate study of its parts. In the 20th century, as I have tried to demonstrate, It was the widespread use of X-ray architecture that made a new way of thinking about architecture possible. So what is happening in the 21st century? The CAT scan may be very well for our field, but the basic X-ray was for architects in the early part of the 20th century. In fact, the CAT scan is simply many X-ray images compiled by a computer to generate cross-sectional views and 3D images of the body internal organs. A typical medical brochure describes the layering of slices this way. Imagine the body as a loaf of bread, and you are looking at one end of the loaf. As you remove each slice of bread, you can see the entire surface of that slice from the crust to the center. The crust, the skin, or the envelope then becomes almost, as you can see, invisible. It's just like a line. What matters is this dense interior, which is rendered like a new and more complex kind of facade. As with the X-ray, architects were very quick to respond. If architectural publications at the beginning and at the middle of the century, I didn't talk about the middle of the century, but we can put as an example Allison and Peter Smithson and their work with the independent group, where you can see a lot of X-rays, and here they are with the independent group. This is the catalog of the Parallel of Life and Art exhibition. And even when they were preparing the exhibition, you can see that image there of the big jeep that Peter had found in an issue of Life magazine. And of course, it's also clearly reflected, their architecture, it clearly reflects that interest, as for example in the Hunstanton School, where everything is exposed, even all the plumbing. It's not by chance that Philip Johnson recognized this as the most mission project and wrote the first major review of this building. Here are the Smithsons. I showed you them before, so young. They were like, I think Allison was barely 23, right, when they won this project. They're like kids. Well, anyway, so if architects from the early 20th century were obsessed, and the mid-20th century still obsessed with the X-ray, contemporary architectural publications are full of CAT scan images. This is, for example, the copy of a catalog of José Luis Mateo, who shows a CAT scan of the brain in the cover of the catalog of his work. Not a building, not his face, like many architects do, but a scan of a brain. The architect, he writes inside, has to act with the calonners of the medic. He cuts, analyzes, and researches, but he must never mummify an organism who once lived. Likewise, UN Studio, Ben van Berkel, and Caroline Boyce also show us CAT scan images of the brain alongside their projects in their book, Move. Those are all images from architects. Alongside their projects, you find pages full of scans. You tell me, why are these images there? Yeah, and you can see that the Renaissance obsession with the brain continues well into the 21st century, as does the interest in the fetus, as you can see again in the work of all these embryological architects like Greg Lynn. And you can see, of course, the effects of this interest in the CAT scan in their architecture. Very quickly, in Oma's entry for the Bibliothèque Nationale competition, the exposure of a skeleton behind a glass scheme gives way to translucent bodies revealing organs. Or here, foreign office architecture, Yokohama Port Terminal also seems to follow the logic of the CAT scan. An endless series, those are early drawings of the project, where you can see this endless series of section cuts, which is used to assemble a 3D body. At Yokohama, there is no simple opposition between outside and inside. Its dream is to be a continuously folded surface where structure and skin are one, and where there are no bones or discrete organs. The CAT scan may be then for us what the basic X-ray was for architects in the 21st century. A new generation of architects already in the 1920s was already producing experimental work under the influence of computer-assisted technologies that allow complete three-dimensional modeling of the body. Perhaps it's not accident that that generation also became fascinated with this other medical procedure, which is the visible human project, which acts physically the operations of the CAT scan by cutting a body in 1 millimeter sections, which are then used to generate an animation of section cuts passing down. Just as with the Renaissance, the invaded body is that of a criminal who, in this case, donated his body to science. So what is happening lately with medical technology? So far, I have sketched out the way technologies of medical diagnostics become integral to the development of architecture, of new forms of architecture. Today, of course, there are new instruments of medical diagnosis and new systems of representation. One of the latest techniques represents yet, I think, another radical transformation of our thinking between inside and outside. This is the M2A camera that was approved by the FDA in 2000, and it's like a little disposable camera that you are supposed to swallow as a pill, and it snaps 2 color pictures a minute for 8 hours as it passes through the 22-foot-long digestive tract. M2A stands for mouth to anus. A recorder, sorry, the size of a Walkman collects these 57,000 images while you go around to doing your normal business in a day. The images then are downloaded on a computer to produce a video of the camera trip through the digestive tract. Scientists in laboratories are also today developing microscopic machines that one day will prowl through the human body like miniature repairman fixing whatever ails us. The similarity with the 1966 movie Fantastic Voyage with Raquel Welch is striking. I don't know whether you remember that film in which a team of scientists is shrunk and injected in the body to repair a what? But a brain, precisely, injury. With the M2A, as in this movie, the body is all transformed into an occupiable interior. The body has been turned inside out. The skin is irrelevant. All there is this endless interior bathed in the light coming from the little capsule of the video camera. What this implies in architecture has not yet become clear. Perhaps something of this is already evident in the experiments of Sana, where the Messian X-ray effects give way to a soft and focused enveloping effect. But meanwhile, I'm back to Wannsee. A group of us finally made it to the other side of the lake with Manfred in search of the mythical Sanatoria that had been here years ago. And there it was, like a modern ruin, melding with the forest, almost shocking in its clarity, and at the same time very moving, as if the fragile bodies, the figures that once occupied the terrace had only just left. Here is the sanatorium in its early years in the other side. And we came back after our excursion to our own sun pavilion here to continue our own cure in Wannsee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beatriz. And please keep standing on that wonderful podium, then you can see everybody who wants to talk.
I have to say one more thing, because I love this pavilion. I really have been so happy here, and the pavilion has made such a big difference in our life. Yes, and I didn't realize that I was being photographed. But we want to tell you that we will take you down there if you want to see it after, later, after the questions. Yeah.
So please ask your questions.
How would Frank White fit into your scheme?
Frank White doesn't fit into my scheme that much because I haven't studied him from this point of view. But all of modern architecture could be seen from that point of view. I would have to go and look. I mean, he does talk about the body extensively, Frank White, about digestion, if I remember correctly. So not all the architects are so focused on tuberculosis. But so he will not be the typical case. Also, he is not that white. I mean, in the United States, I will go, if anything, for California, for all the Europeans that went to California and imported over there all the European preoccupations with the body. Many of them from German and Austrian, like Schindler and Neutra, etc., which also recommended their clients not only to have modern houses, but to sleep outside, right? I mean, that's the point of the Schindler house and the Lowell house. And also it's a collaboration between an architect and a doctor, the Lovells and Neutra and Schindler, right? But I don't know, I mean, Frank, you're right, maybe somebody else knows more about it. And I've never been very interested in Frank, you're right myself. Sorry.
More of a feeling than real kind of knowledge, but it feels that the diagram obsession in the 90s, you know, mostly with the Dutch architects, and you mentioned Rem Koolhaas's library in Paris. There's a certain similar understanding of transparency of the inner organism of buildings.
Yeah.
Is there something that, you know, you jumped from, let's say, the transparency of the X-ray directly to a transparency that we have maybe now that's more fluid, but is the diagram somehow a step in between those two?
Yeah, well, you know, I think, for example, in the case of where is he now? In the case of these, I mean, I think we are not talking anymore about an X-ray effect. It's more of a CAT scan. I mean, it's even more obvious in the case of Alejandro, no? Of the Yokohama. So even the fact that all of a sudden we represent architecture in this way, since when have we exercised architecture, right? I mean, it's also interesting, technically speaking, that one of the first to have computers in the office was Frank Gehry, no? And Alejandro went to interview him in '95, imagine how early, in California, and he asked him immediately, well, I asked the technical team because Frank didn't know anything, where do you get these machines? And you know what he was told? They were from the hospital down the street. They were used before to guide laser surgery. So the state of the art in medical technology is handed down to architectural offices at the beginning of the use of computers. The software is the same, and so it is clearly a new way of thinking that is also reflected in the architecture, in my opinion, which is no longer that of the same. And I'm fascinated by the fact that they themselves keep using. I mean, why will you, as an architect, put a scan in the cover? Because you are looking at scans. You are so fascinated with a scan in the same way that the Mies and Le Corbusier were fascinated with the X-rays.
You were speaking about the relentless horizontal privileging, and you kind of...
The relentless?
The
horizontality, yeah.
And the reclining patient. It's very convincing.
Yes.
But I'm also thinking of your city, which is relentless vertical.
New York?
Yeah.
Well, but then Le Corbusier will say that New York is a medieval city that is not modern at all. Yeah, it's not modern, it's not horizontal enough, right? Yeah, but at the same time, you can argue there's a horizontality in the skyscraper. If you look at the skyscrapers of Mies, for example, in Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, and the way he represents it, and even the way he conceptualizes it, is in terms of slices. So this is what is important to him.
Right. But it is important in a way that, I mean, to this day, the highest building, right? It's always mentioned. What is the highest building? So there's another effect, obviously, that's reached by height.
Yeah, exactly. But then in the end, if you think about the occupation of the individual, then it's framed in a horizontal frame. You may be as high as you want, but you are still framed by this view. Your view of the wall is framed by these two horizontal planes, like a sandwich.
It could be two discourses, like the medical discourse is the horizontal discourse, and the power discourse is the vertical discourse.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, of course. I mean, you know, that would be a different story. Yeah, yeah. Yes, Frank.
We were talking about earlier about the Susan Sontag and AIDS and its metaphors, that book, and that portion where she's talking about tuberculosis as this kind of disease that was aestheticized versus, say, cancer, which was seen as kind of base and ugly.
Yeah.
So what happens? I mean, and there's an architecture that supports that idea, and then it seems like at some point it gets abandoned. If you think about contemporary medical architecture, not so much residential, but where it's really a kind of pragmatic solution or it's a technical solution. And it seems like those other sort of instincts get dropped out somewhere along the way, and we end up with actually pretty banal type of architecture to react to that.
Yeah, normally you do. I mean, and these technical problems are always there. But what interests me, I suppose, are the architects who are thinking. And this, in that line, I will include definitely Mies and Le Corbusier, and of course also Alejandro and Zaira Polo, etc. And therefore, and how they are thinking and they are theorizing of their architecture has so much to do with the body and with the medical body in particular. This is what I'm trying to, not the general practice in general of the architects, right? Yeah, Sandra.
Do you see it as a feedback loop? You start with a sanatorium in terms of architecture, which aims is to heal the body, and then you go on with the X-ray having an influence on architecture becoming more of a glass Scotch structure, very transparent, and then you go on, skipping a bit, couple of steps, getting to Sana and sort of with the blur and this blurring. So I wonder if it is a simultaneous process or in a feedback loop, or there is a starting point and then an effect.
I don't know. I don't normally think in those terms of a starting point and so. But I mean, you know, I can tell you about the sanatoria, the sanatoriums and tuberculosis. I think this was the earlier part of the research. When I start thinking about it, I start thinking in terms of, well, you know, obviously architecture is responding to what was at the time a very, very serious threat. And it's actually providing, I mean, architects are always opportunistic. This is a service profession. We are here to help, no? So you have this problem, and all the medicals think that this is how you actually cure tuberculosis, that it has to do with air, ventilation. Let me tell you, we can provide for that, right? Remove all the ornament, remove all these cornices, the dust accumulates over there. Okay, no problem. No cornices, no this. And all of a sudden, modern architecture emerged. That's the point, right? And then in the process of studying this, I realized, okay, but some buildings are even starting to look like X-rays. And then looking more deeply into the test, and I realized, okay, but they have images of X-rays next to their buildings. That's not normal. I mean, you know, why would you do that, right? And then reading into the test, you realize they're making a lot of references to tuberculosis. So they put it all out there. I don't know why. For so long, we have studied architecture from every single point of view and neglected what was, if you want, on our face, what was maybe so obvious as to render itself invisible. That architects in the 20th century were responding to a very, very serious threat. Now, extending to the present, that's what we always do as architects, no? We always want to try to understand, okay, and now what's happening now, and what kinds of things are developing in medicine, and in which way they could affect the way in which we think about architecture. And then I was struck by that, by the CAT scan, and why are all these people, I mean, can you imagine to have a catalog of an architect's work? You have to think about it. It's not normal to put a CAT scan. You have to think about why are they putting a CAT scan? Because they are interested in the CAT scan, because the thinking of architecture is already changing, very much affected by the medical thought. Right? Yes.
In terms of these kind of scans, I would like to relate it to Berlin back, because I think it has a lot to do with how architects want to control geometry, how they, and then when we look back, for example, at how Hans Scharoun was, Philharmonie was built, they couldn't calculate the structure, didn't have a computer yet, and so they used slice up models to pick like the geometry and to have it built. So I think it has also a lot, not only in terms of the medical body, but also in terms of the body as a geometry and how architects has to deal with these. It came up in the 90s when we were trying to build these kind of biometrical buildings. And I think it has a lot to do with what kind of tools architects have at their disposal.
Yes, it could be that those are the tools that are at your disposal. I mean, and in fact, I remember very well that those early years when there was, for example, a conference in Buenos Aires, part of the Anybody, and there it was, and for some reason I had done something on Kistler. And there is, I don't know, Ben van Berkel and Greg Lynn and Alejandro Zerapolo, and they keep repeating the same thing. Not Alejandro so much, but Ben van Berkel and Greg. That these kinds of shapes that we do now would have been impossible before the computer. And these kinds of shapes, and he presented the pavilion in Milan and so on and so. And by chance, I had just presented Kistler, right? And Kistler, of course, is pre-computer by a lot, right? And then Arata Isozaki say, oh, it's funny that you keep saying that your forms are unique and that they would have never been possible before the computer because they look very similar to Kistler. And then after that, Kistler became like such an important reference for all that generation. So, of course, the shapes already existed even before, I mean, or some of these interest in these shapes could exist for a generation of architects that did it all by hand. What became possible with the computer is precisely what I just described with the laser, the computers used for laser surgery. All of a sudden, the model was like a body that could be, you could determine exactly the point that you were going to operate in the same way you could decide the same things in your architecture with that kind of precision. But that the technology itself comes from medicine, I think is for me very, very interesting. Yeah. Daniel was here.
Yeah, thank you. Terrific lecture. My question was very much like the last question. I wondered whether the story of the CAT scan and the story of the X-ray are really continuous with each other, or in some ways, if the CAT scan isn't an inversion of the X-ray or a change in some ways, because the X-ray serves as a kind of analogy for architecture, a model for architecture, a way of imagining architecture. And in the story you tell, the CAT scan is actually a device for creating architecture. Geary uses these tools. And so I wonder if there might be another way of telling the story where the CAT scan architecture is not a version or an articulation of X-ray architecture, but in a sense an attempt to repudiate it or experience it in some other way.
You're right. I mean, it's a very interesting point, because of course the X-ray are not generating the architecture, and at the same time there are complications there, right? Because there is also something clearly aesthetic to this, to the use that they are making of this scan. So they are also finding other kinds of inspiration that has less to do with how is it made and more with other stories. Like, I mean, what is all of this, right? And why do we represent the building this way? This is obviously all pre-computer anyway. They are not. So they are both things. But I think you are right. They are two. The X-ray itself was not used to generate buildings. Something of what you say. I don't know what I wanted to say. Yes. of course, that the X-ray, on the one hand, you can say is about transparency, but there's nothing that transparent about an X-ray. It's kind of all appears like more like a blur. So how they make this association between the glass architecture, which is really transparent, and the X-ray, which is not that transparent, is also, there is a gap there, right, that one could think about, and why this association is made. Yes.
In terms of history, you started with Leonardo da Vinci and his structures around the human body, and then modern architecture, and in between Rococo, Baroque, and Victorian. What kind of obsession would you suggest us to think about? Are there also health problems
I'm
in
sure there are.
or other dimensions of the human nature and of humanity?
It was not. I was not intended to do a comprehensive history, and I will never do that. I was just trying to say that this preoccupation with the medical body has a long history, and that I'm not an expert in Viollet-le-Duc, but I was struck by the fact that even just a cursory look at Viollet-le-Duc gives you that reference, which is not very much emphasized otherwise in architectural history. Okay? Yes, Leonard.
There's a scene, I don't know if you focused on it, but it's worth refocusing. I don't have a question, but just a suggestion. There's an extraordinary scene in the Magic Mountain about an X-ray. And it's a kind of pivotal moment when
Hans Castor
Hans Castor is looking at the X-ray. And it really, I mean, that's a moment when this piece of technology seems to, with various ironic circles around it, to hold the key to life. So it's a kind of, itself, the magic center of that novel is that moment with the X-ray.
Yes. I was fascinated by this. Of course, one could just do a book on that. I mean, all the architecture, all the modern architecture in Thomas Mann Magic Mountain that even experts in Thomas Mann don't know about it. We had one such expert here a few weeks ago, and I brought the question, and he hadn't thought about it. But of course, as an architect, I read Thomas Mann, and I say, what sanatorium is he talking about? This is really great. I mean, it must be amazing, because he's describing in great detail very modern buildings. But I was also fascinated by this moment with the X-ray, particularly when Hans Castor is holding, I was remembering also another one, holding the X-ray of his love, remember? And he's holding it like if it was like this thing, like a photograph, but it's like this relic there, like this woman that has, this Russian woman, Madame, that has left, and Susu,
But also the Proust, I mean, there's also Swann's X-ray, which is very significant.
Right. It's full in literature. I'm sure is and in many ways people have done this work in literature. I mean, Susan Sontag did a fantastic work with illness as metaphor, but one could do more, but because there is so much modern architecture and so much. So it is a very good suggestion. I'll look into it. But the point is that this work has been done in literature clearly. It has not been done in architecture.
Now, if it's so important for architecture, it's no wonder that it will be also important in other fields,
Yes.
creative fields.
Yes.
Yeah, it makes your thesis even stronger.
Yes, but of course, I mean, if it's such a trauma, such an incredibly dominant disease that was killing, at a certain point it threatened the survival of the Western civilization. I mean, they were one of 3 or something were affected by tuberculosis. How can we imagine that it will affect all the fields of creativity and not architecture? But it affects architecture in even a more significant way, and nevertheless is neglected in our histories. Should we go and see the pavilion? Okay.